Welcome to the fifth and last FESI workshop for the year of 2020 and 2021. For those who are live with us on the call right now, I want to wish all of those who are observing a Ramadan Kareem. Those of you who are fasting, please know we are aware that today's session will coincide with the 8:08 p.m. iftar. Please know that with this being streamed live on YouTube Live, you can pause at any time or return back to this link at your convenience and review, rewatch using this exact same link that brought you here tonight. So again, this link that brought you to us tonight will also serve as a link of the recording of this session when we are done. On behalf of FESI, myself, my co-chair, Saima Chaudhary, as well as our York University Faculty of Education advisors, Carl James, Vidya Shah, and Jack Negro, adjunct professor at York University and superintendent at Durham District School Board, we would like to welcome you to tonight's session, Streaming and Schoolings. For our audience members tonight who are with us live on YouTube, thank you for joining us from across the nation and the world right now. We encourage you to engage using the YouTube chat feature during tonight's session. And for those of you that would like to pose a question to our panelists, please type your question in all caps in our chat box on YouTube. Our FESI co-chair, Saima Chaudhary, will be managing the YouTube live chat box. Thank you for doing that, Saima. Before we get started, we would like to give a shout out to some of the people who are making today's event happen behind the scenes. First, to Anderson Coward and his team at the communications department at the Faculty of Education at York University, who helps with all the promotional and communication items. Huge thank you for your support. And to Laura Temporal, seconded faculty and course director at the Faculty of Education, who will be live tweeting during our session tonight. Thank you, Laura, for your time and your support. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Sultan Rana, and I'm a course director at York University's Faculty of Education, on comment from York Region District School Board. I would like to start off by acknowledging the land, and we'll do so in sharing a moment this past week where I myself sought solace and clarity by and through connecting with the land. Allow me to share where I'm from. I'm a settler on this land. My parents came from Pakistan, one colonized nation to another, and settled on the unceded territory on the northeast side of the Grand River, a land promised to the Mohawk, Black loyalists, and other loyalists who fought under Tayudunaga, also known by his Anglo-Saxon name as Joseph Brant, in the American Revolution. My parents established both homes and businesses on this territory, known today as Brantford, and have resided there since 1978. I was born in Brantford and was raised there until I left for university at 19 years old. I currently reside in Pickering, Ontario, a land that falls within the Williams Treaty boundaries under the responsibility of the Mississauga of Scugog First Nation. A Giksan elder speaking to government officials in 2003 stated, "If this is your land, where are your stories?" As a settler and treaty person on the land, I'm not okay with making claim to a land that is unceded, but I may have a story. The land my home occupies is close to a portion of the Seton Trail, and I often go to connect with the land, both for visual stimulation, but also thoughtful contemplation. Arguably, it's therapeutic. Being your moderator today, I walk into this topic feeling that of an imposter and a charlatan. As I moderate a conversation about streaming in schools, I know that while I did have my verbal tussle with the dismissive guidance counselor or two from grades 11 to OAC, I am a benefactor of streaming. And when I came to my profession, I partook supportively in special education meetings, IPRCs, teaching in the gifted stream, and engaged in 8th grade transition meetings with nearby high schools, placing students from 8th grade into college and general courses, thinking to myself, I was setting them up for success. I have these stories from my distant past. So with these thoughts of guilt and shame, for the past 2 weeks, I've headed to the forest to sit amongst the tall, thin, uniformly organized trees of the Seton Trail. Trees whose names I don't know, but can only say their long, thin trunks remind me of the ones some may see in the bamboo forests of Japan. And as I look up at these trees, I feel like they teach me something. With the wind being captured at every angle with these thin giants, they engage in a slow dance, swaying back and forth. These tall trees move with the gusts of winds that push and pull them. As I look at the trees, I see the contrast in color on their bark. It shows how they've acclimatized to the natural elements around them. Some branches high and untouched, and some closer to the ground. In this trance these trees have me in, I realize we are like these trees, growing in seeming uniformity, but we take to the push and pull of the wind differently. We change with the seasons, defoliate and shed old ideas and grow further. Not dwelling on seasons past or leaves and branches fallen from before. They continue to grow, as should we. And that's where I find solace in my past actions. A quote from Indigenous scholar Manulani Aluli Mayer speaks to me in this situation. She says, I quote, "What I know now is that my own interpretation gives me understanding, and it always has to pass through my own experience. I know better now. I know, having had the experience of complicity and complacency in a system that streams, often systemically predicated on race, class, and gender, again, I know better. And it is because of my past, with more conviction than ever, I devote my energy to dismantling a system that lives within our schooling with the intention of totally abolishing it. I want to appreciate the land in which I live and thrive for teaching me while keeping me grounded. And also my co-lead Saima Chaudhry and advisor Vidya Shah, who helped me parse through my feelings with this land acknowledgement. And now for the land acknowledgement in line with York University. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And now I would like to pass it on to Jack Negro to speak about the conclusion of this year's series and introduce the one who will be doing our opening remarks today, Nora Marsh, Director of Education for Durham District School Board. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sultan, and thanks for a very thoughtful reflection to open this session in a really good way. Good evening, everyone. My name is Jack Negro, and I am a superintendent with the Durham District School Board and adjunct professor at York University. Welcome to the last of 5 sessions making up the 12th annual Faculty of Education Summer Institute at York University. Those of you in the Greater Toronto area may be chuckling about attending the Summer Institute on an April day with a few centimeters of snow on the ground, but this will pass and summer will be here soon. When Dr. Carl James and I and a few others about a dozen years ago met in a small meeting room on the 3rd floor of a building on the York U campus, we thought it might be a good thing to have a summer learning opportunity for educators. It was a way to stir things up a bit. Identity-based data collection was at the top of our mind at the time. Nobody in that room could imagine that the Summer Institute would grow to what it currently is and operate in a pandemic year, hold 5 webinars throughout that pandemic year with about 1,000 registrants for each. We have over 1,000 tonight, including one that was national and international in scope. It has always been the goal of this institute to disrupt and dismantle, to get in good trouble, to challenge policymakers, to challenge institutions, to transform, to be fearless, Too many students have suffered injustices in Ontario schools for too long. Our students really can't wait any longer. And tonight we are thankful for the opportunity to engage in these discussions with you. Thankful to share a vision for the schools we need. We are thankful for the outstanding organizational team for this year's Institute. Professor Vidya Shah, Saima Chowdhury, Sultan Rana, and the Dean of the Faculty of Education at York University, Sharon Murphy, for their unwavering support. Many district school boards have been perennial partners in the support of this institute. We thank TDSB, Toronto Catholic District School Board, York Region District School Board, Peel District School Board, Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, Durham District School Board, Halton District School Board, Halton Catholic District School Board, Ottawa Carleton DSB, and Kawartha Pine Ridge DSB for both their past and hopefully ongoing support. And we are happy to have collaborated this past year with associations like the Administrators Black Caucus of Ontario and Toronto Catholic Children's Aid. We are also very pleased to announce that the Summer Institute will continue in a yet undetermined form for the summer of 2021, with the hopes to reconvene the Institute to in-person status in 2022. Please watch your Twitter accounts for more information about that in the coming weeks and months. Tonight's webinar is focused on a very problematic structure in Ontario education: streaming. It is problematic because it has disproportionately negatively impacted Black, Indigenous, and low-income communities. Ibram Kendi offers a way of thinking about such a structure. He says, if a policy or practice, intentionally or unintentionally, disproportionately and negatively impacts a racialized group, it is a racist policy or practice. Tonight, we will hear from some prominent thinkers and doers. The team from TDSB and York U you will hear from tonight has done transformative work in this area for many years. And we are fortunate to have Allison, Jason, Monday, Kadeen, and Jillian share their experiences tonight. But first, an important component of each of these webinars has been an opening commentary by a director of education that has played a leadership role in the different areas of focus of equity. You will recall that over the past year, we have been joined by Dr. Brendan Brown at Toronto Catholic District School Board, Colleen Russell Rollins from Peel District School Board, and Camille Williams-Taylor from Ottawa Carleton District School Board. Tonight, we will hear from an influential director of education who has also provided provincial leadership in de-streaming. We're so pleased to be joined this evening from a true pioneer of actions to challenge streaming in Ontario, Durham District School Board Director of Education, Nora Marsh. Nora's work in de-streaming began almost a decade ago in Limestone District School Board in the Kingston area. Nora began her career in teaching in 1991 as an English teacher in LDSB. And as a principal, Nora's commitment to collaborative professionalism and student success garnered provincial recognition for improved outcomes for students. Nora has been a senior leader in 3 school boards over the last 14 years and is currently the Director of Education for Durham. In addition, Nora served as CEO of EQAO. She chose to go there at a tumultuous time in the agency's controversial history and moved its modernization plan away from a focus on technology to one of using technology to create assessments that were more culturally reflective and relevant and informed by student voice. Her work there in establishing student advisories and with the Education Committee of the Chiefs of Ontario informed the blueprint for more flexible and adaptive assessments and changed the reporting methodology to reflect a more equitable reporting system. During that time, she worked closely with teacher federations to inform planning. Nora left the agency shortly after releasing research that was critical of the provincial government's new policy of an accreditation test for new teachers. In addition, Nora has served the province's educational communities as chair of the Ontario Institute for Educational Leadership, president of the Ontario Public Supervisory Officials Association, and internationally with OECD examining student well-being metrics. Nora's commitment to mobilizing knowledge networks provincially has led to work internationally to focus on equity of outcomes. But for those who know Nora, they recognize her heart is still anchored locally, evidenced through her longstanding relationship with organizations such as United Way and Big Brothers and Big Sisters. In all that Nora does, she has a reputation as a passionate advocate for public education and an unrelenting focus on student engagement, equity, well-being, and achievement. Nora is fortunate to have 3 20-something children, Liam, Enya, and Moira, who keep her grounded and laughing alongside her husband, David. Please join me in welcoming Director Nora Marsh.
Jack, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And I'm just going to focus on getting into some good trouble with good company this evening. I'm very happy to be here to listen to champions of de-streaming. And I was asked, as Jack indicated, to provide introduction to the topic this evening through the lens of Director of Education and my own previous experience in leading this work within a school board 9 years ago. I feel the need, though, to always begin by expressing my identity as being a white, heterosexual, cisgendered settler. And what that means when I approach the work and the thinking of being Director of Education and the importance of understanding my privilege and the white supremacy that has created the educational system. That requires me to take responsibility for my own learning and constantly be engaging as a learner to facilitate and dismantle systemic racism and oppression, which we are obviously going to focus on this evening. I think it will become apparent in my comments tonight that true systemic change doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come just from legislative changes such as de-streaming, because those in positions of power can influence and impact workarounds. And I think that's something that the history in Ontario demonstrates when we consider pathways for students. To my knowledge, since at least 2003, there has been strong evidence that applied programming was disadvantaging students in Ontario. For 18 years, research related to this topic told a very bleak story. Put simply, students in applied programming were more likely to fall behind in their credit accumulation, receive lower grades, and not pursue apprenticeships or college pathways, despite the rosy promise that applied program had ushered in with it, that it would lead to those opportunities for students. It was modeled with the sense that it was hands-on learning, but a viable pathway. But time has shown that that was not what happened once it was implemented. There are mountains of evidence that repeatedly tell the same tale within Ontario. And most disturbingly within that evidence is that it's very clear that students who have been traditionally marginalized, Indigenous, Black, living in poverty, have special education needs, are far more likely than any other students to be enrolled in applied programming in this province, as are boys. Our system biases are at work when educators play the role of attempting to predict an individual child's future success by recommending a course pathway. We're limiting opportunities. In Limestone 9 years ago, where I had the great joy of being a superintendent of secondary programming, we decided it was time to change the assumptions and practice, and we decided to begin with mathematics. We began there because there was such a strongly held belief by some that success in math, more so than any other subject, was based on prior knowledge. And for that reason, more students often ended up in applied mathematics than any other subject. And that was true within our district and within the province of Ontario. So we began with intention where the assumption was most deeply held to combat the assumption across all subject areas. We felt if we could do it in mathematics, we would show that we could do it for all subjects in grade 9. And we had the research to support our decision. Years of cohort data showed us that students who chose academic math, despite having low performance in grade 6 EQAO, were far much more likely to be successful in the academic program. So locally, we wanted to use that data and explore it further. And so we looked at grade 8 report card grades and determined that really the key factor to success in grade 9 was choosing academic. And that was troublesome for us in terms of looking at what was happening within the system. This data challenged assumptions about conditions for success, and we therefore wanted to look at supporting structurally what the evidence was showing us. For that reason, we began in a pilot with a school where we saw a dominance of applied programming. So at that time, there was about a third of the students provincially studying in applied courses. And we started in a school where we saw 2/3 of the students in applied programming. And we worked with the community to offer academic-only mathematics for students. It was really a resounding success. 89% of the students achieved level 3 or 4 in EQAO grade 9 that first year in the pilot. And we were really pleased to have an independent source of data from the point of view. We had other sources of data we were working with, but we were concerned because we wanted this to be successful, that it wouldn't be necessarily as believable if we only used the data that we were collecting locally. So the EQAO data was one of the compelling factors when we tried to shift mindsets in terms of the opportunities for all students in academic programming. But I think most inspiring was the work we did with focus groups of students who showed us firsthand about their confidence, their curiosity, their courage and confidence to be curious as math learners. And I can remember we did classroom observations as well and listening to the math talk in late November. So pretty early still in the year, and seeing students' confidence and curiosity grow since September. Educator belief in the students and creativity to think differently about how mathematics was taught led these students to feel like they could be successful. And instead of closing doors to students by at a key transition time telling them that we want them to be successful and therefore we want them to go into applied programming, we were doing the opposite. We were welcoming them into a new school, into the secondary schooling by inviting them into academic programming and telling them we believed in them and we were going to work to be successful together. Imagine the impact of a student starting in a new school, instead of being counseled out, being told that they're invited in. The emotional and intellectual impact and sense of belonging at a key transitional point set a new stage for students. So all these years later, and having used my brief time as CEO of EQAO to vocalize on a provincial platform that there are significant problems with applied programming and that we needed to examine that as a province and do something about it, I look forward to the fall and I'm cautiously optimistic. First, I think it's the right thing to do, and the research very clearly demonstrates that we have disadvantaged students because of the systemic oppression of our system. I also know, based on my firsthand experience at Limestone, that it will be successful. But I'm cautious because while it's the right thing to do and we recognize it's the right thing to do, changing a structure is only a small piece of the puzzle. And for those of us who've been around as long as I've been around, we remember the structural change of the common curriculum. And during that time, many schools organized classes by prior achievement and altered expectations. And while it was all done under the belief that it was to assist students, really what it was doing was lowering expectations for some students, and it was bias at work. We cannot let that happen again. Moreover, I worry that the current conversation is focused too much on grade 9. This is a K-12 challenge. How do we change our system so that students who are struggling don't get different expectations, but that we create a system that reaches them and helps them excel? Moving from grade to grade while we modify curriculum and call it accommodations is not only a disservice, it's unjust. We need to figure out how to change the system so that we move away from such a crowded curricula and focus on skills that really matter. And instead of low-level content that overwhelms the planning, assessment, evaluation, and therefore educators and students alike, we need to expect a curriculum that is focused on the important skills for today and tomorrow, and is both culturally reflective and relevant for students. For math, that means we actively need to develop the relationships between the big ideas and approach the learning and the curriculum from a spiraled perspective, where students get to understand and contemplate the connections between the big ideas within the curriculum and grow their depth of understanding of concepts by being able to revisit and go through it in a spiraled approach. Let's be, I think, ambitious for this change. And to be ambitious for this change, we all need to be prepared to be courageous and name bias when we see it at work. For that reason, in the Durham District School Board, we're committing to also doing the same and only offering academic English for students next year. Because like math, we know that English is a gatekeeper for students. What weighs on me in terms of the efforts of educators is the timing of this important and necessary change. We know that everyone is exhausted and has been distressed from the pandemic. And that, combined with the lack of PD time and curriculum coming late, does not set the ideal conditions for change and can provide perhaps an excuse to delay. However, this change cannot wait for better conditions or for the pandemic to be over. In fact, the way this pandemic has played out in Ontario has heightened the disadvantage of marginalized groups and makes this work ever more important. So we need to work with educators to assist in implementing this change. At the Durham District School Board, we've used this period of the pandemic to try to focus so much on the role of human rights, well-being, and relationships in education. And we'll continue with that approach throughout the changes in curriculum, understanding that that work is at the center of a successful system, and that if we want our students to experience lifelong success, we need to focus on human rights, we need to focus on their well-being, and we need to focus on building connections between educators and students. The value of a strong public education system is that there is equity of outcomes. As public educators, that is the work we have to do. And the research is very clear that we have not achieved that and we have more work to do. I'm really thrilled to be part of this evening's community. Thank you so much for asking me to open. And I'm looking forward to listening and to learning from those in the field who are doing the work of growing possibilities and positively impacting trajectories. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jack, for introducing and for speaking to FESI's conclusion. And Nora, Marsh, I can't say it enough. Thank you so much for speaking unapologetically in terms that cannot be misconstrued and laying it all out in a very strong call to action that's rooted in evidence and time and tested experiences. So thank you so much for starting us off with that amazing opening. Thank you very much. Now to our panelists for this evening. In order for us to maximize the speaking time of our panelists, we would like to direct you to a more fulsome bio of our guests on the FESI website, which is fesi.blog.yorku.ca. And it will be listed when we share our screens to show the questions throughout the evening. So you'll have a chance to see the website for that. But knowing that their detailed bios are online, without further ado, I'd like to have you all meet our panelists for tonight. So first, I would like you all to meet Jillian Perrick, Assistant Professor and Canada Research Chair in Inclusion, Disability, and Education at York University. Jillian, you there? There we go. Awesome. Hi. Monday Gala, Principal of Westview Centennial Secondary School in the Toronto District School Board. Allison Games San Vicente, centrally assigned principal coach for the Toronto District School Board.
Good evening, everyone.
Jason Toe, coordinator of secondary mathematics and academic pathways at the Toronto District School Board. And Kadeen Bankasingh, community organizer, facilitator, and advocate representing CASE, which is a coalition for alternatives to streaming in education, and also, most importantly, maybe, a mother. Welcome, everyone. So we're going to get started off. I'm going to ask two of our panelists, Jillian and Jason, to provide a baseline for the differing entry points for our audience tonight, for those in and out of the Ontario context. So Jason, could you please briefly set the context of what the history of streaming is, what the history of streaming in Ontario is in our provincial context?
Sure. Thanks for having me here today. So I'm going to take us on a trip to like the Wayback Machine and go all the way to pre-Confederation, starting with the Grammar Schools Act of 1807 that created elite grammar schools that were only for upper class children, while the political elite thought that lower class children didn't need to learn anything other than what they, could need to learn while they were working. So it took a rebellion in 1837 for people to wake up and realize that you actually need to have an educated citizenry to maintain a functioning society. So if you think about it, education in Ontario began with streaming. Like that's how deep the roots of streaming are in Ontario. So to look more into kind of how we see streaming as it is currently, we just need to look at the baby boom. So after World War II in the 1960s, under the Robarts Plan, named after John Robarts, who was the Minister of Education and became the Premier, they created 3 streams in Ontario. So there was arts and science, which went to university, business and commerce, which went primarily to college, and then science, technology, and trades, which went to the workforce. And so as you can predict, there was a stratification in terms of race and class in these streams, as well as differential outcomes. So there was also a proliferation of hundreds of special education schools across Ontario, only those really for students with special education needs. Once families and students, mainly from working class families, saw that only about 20% of these students were graduating, people voted with their feet and abandoned these schools, and many of them soon shuttered. But the structure, like this actual structure of separating students, like still existed after and continued to separate students. So then by the 80s, they tried to fix things by creating 3 new streams. So again, we're trying to fix streaming with streaming, and they created advanced, general, and basic, which is what many of us grew up with. But again, as you can predict, students in advanced classes were graduating at a rate of around 80% or over, while over 80% of students in basic courses were dropping out. And of course, race and class inequities in these streams continue to exist. This led to the Redwanski report that recommended de-streaming in the 90s. And the vast majority of teachers that taught during this time will remember this as, like a failed experiment and a lot of stress, and mainly because the supports weren't there for educators. And I don't think it was fully understood that de-streaming was really an act of social justice. And so as a result, teachers unions took a position as anti-de-streamers. And that's a position that unions are having trouble moving away from, to be honest. We do know that de-streaming was actually benefiting students in spite of all this. We have research that shows that students were benefiting with achievement and attendance. But in 1998, Ontario restreamed again into academic and applied and essentials programming. And history continues to repeat itself, right? With Black and Indigenous students, students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and students with special education needs being disadvantaged yet again. So we've reformed education over and over and over again by installing different kinds of streaming structures, hoping that something would change, but we know that inequities have continued not to be addressed. And so that's why we're here now. right, in 2021, talking about de-streaming, because we know better than ever now that streaming reinforces and perpetuates systemic racism, classism, ableism, societal inequities, full stop. And now we're learning how to deal with it. So that's our history lesson.
No, thank you. Very clear timeline. And, we're still making history as we speak. So thank you for that. Now to Jillian, a very, very complex question. In a nutshell, what is streaming?
No small thing. Thanks so much, Sultan, and thanks for that history lesson, Jason. And thanks also for having me be part of this discussion tonight. I really appreciate this opportunity. So I think traditional notions of streaming often refer to that ever important grade 8 to grade 9 transition and the pathways through high school. But it's helpful to conceptualize streaming, I think, as a far more expansive system that includes both formal and informal practices. So when I think of streaming, I think of really any form of ability grouping that has the potential to impact students' immediate and long-term trajectories through school. So streaming is really premised on the idea that there is this pedagogical benefit, particularly for students in lower streams, in congregating students together into these perceived lower ability groups. But this is not what has been evidenced in research at all. In fact, study after study shows that streaming is not only pedagogically ineffective, but is also a primary contributor, as was said by Jason, to racial and class inequities in schools. And I think it's really important in these discussions to keep in mind that ability itself is not neutral. It is not objective. It is a highly constructed and is vulnerable to bias. So in fact, I would argue that streaming in all of its forms is a primary mechanism through which racism, classism, and other forms of discrimination are enacted in schools. I used to do a lot of research maybe about 5 years ago, on students' experiences of belonging in school. And one of our findings was that every school has its own social structure. And because it's a school and not another type of institution, the relationship between who is perceived as having social value can be tightly tied to how ability is perceived and privileged in education. So when I think back to where streaming begins, not historically, but just in the context or trajectory of a student's time in school, I've actually been working with Dr. Catherine Underwood from Ryerson University through her national project on services in the early years. And through that project, it was discovered that many children identified with disability were actually refused entry into kindergarten and recommended that they do not start school until grade 1, so already altering their pathway. Sometimes upon entry into kindergarten, children are placed into kindergarten diagnostic programs at age 3 and 4 and 5. French immersion can also begin in the early grades, specialized arts programs, gifted programs, special education programs. Many of these really take off around grade 4, although there are many entry points throughout elementary and secondary school. In addition to the academic applied and locally developed pathways that begin in grade 9, university, college, mixed and workplace in grades 11 and 12. But even within there are also a number of programs offered at the secondary level that act as this expansion of the traditional streaming system. So all of these programs ultimately organize students by perceived ability and can dramatically alter students' access to opportunities after high school, including access to post-secondary education.
Wow. So everybody's in on it. You've implicated K to 12.
It's all, yeah. And I will post-secondary next.
100%. Thank you so much, Jason and Jillian, for setting the context. Let's get started with our questions that will guide us through tonight. So the first of 5 questions we have, and this question will be posed to Jason and Kadeen. So first question is, what are some of the myths, mindsets, and frameworks that give rise to streaming? Kadeen, I'll have you go first, and then we'll follow up with Jason.
Thank you very much, Sultan, and I'm very thankful to be here with all of you tonight, a part of this great conversation. Yeah, I thought about this one and have been thinking about this one, and I'm really my son's in the background gaming, so if you hear him, know that he is also very much my point of reference and how I think, and I'm sharing some of my experiences this evening as well. But I really started to think about this question, approach this question from the perspective of parents and communities, right? And the ways in which we also and can believe, at some point in time that this is the alternative, or these are the only options. This is the reality for what our children need or what we should expect of them in school. And I kind of explored this range of feelings and emotions that I've encountered in the community, going from, one extreme of, the acknowledgement and the recognition of blatant racist systems, and institutional violence that perpetuate and are intentionally, taking our children and our Black boys and pipelining them into the prison systems, right? And that type of, reality and acknowledgement, and how that has to, impact a family or a parent or a single mother so often in our communities, right? And how, that almost makes them hard sometimes. You're constantly fighting, right? And on that one extreme down to the next extreme of the parents who say that, what, the teachers and the administrators know best, right? They're the experts, right? What they say is right. And in fact, if they're saying that my child is only capable of this, well, then in fact, they should know. So we move actually from one extreme into the next of like complete complacency and really handing all of our, our children's futures and well-beings over to these individuals in the schools as well. And so in some ways, we and our belief that we are powerless to those who are making the decisions for us or on our behalf, or we don't know as much as the experts in our schools, that then also say, hey, what, we need to go along with what's being decided and what's being passed down and these decisions that are being made without having or knowing that we have the ability to question, to advocate, to contend, if you will, with these decisions that are being made. I want to really speak to Gillian's points as well around the kindergarten experience, because I know that's where my anxiety for my son started. Very different than my daughter, right, who went through high school and I was able to support her. But the reality of my son going into school, I quit full-time work. I was like, nope, if I'm not present and able to be here for him through these early stages, I'm not sure what's going to happen to him in the school. And it was like sleepless nights, if you can imagine, for quite a while in preparation for that. But I also have know that right now, that effort and that struggle that we start, and that fight that we start in grade kindergarten when our children are 3, 4 years old, it's tiring, right? And so what does it mean right now to be able to fight that fight continuously all the way to grade 9, all the way to the end of grade 12 to make that happen? So at some point in time, we're contending with IEPs, right? And education plans and behavioral plans and all of these other documents and records that are ultimately going to determine what decisions or suggestions and recommendations guidance counselors are going to make in grade 8, what experiences our kids are going to have in grade 9. Those records are never removed from OSSR files. And after many conversations today, I just want to end by saying, someone shared something with me that was so impactful, that rest, in fact, is political. And so this idea that we get a chance to take breaks or that we stop fighting, there's a political connotation to it, because in fact, we don't get a chance to rest when we're marginalized, when we're fighting for our children. And what does that mean when it's time for us to continually have to advocate for our children at a particular, at a level? It's very difficult. So I don't know if that really answered the question. I was just really able to say that there's kind of all these different experiences, mindsets that parents even have that potentially give a lot of power back to educators and to the institutions, to our school systems, that really, if we are supported and we are able to build our awareness and our knowledge, we can do this work for our children, much earlier and not leave them subject to the system. So thank you.
Thank you. Jason, go ahead.
Thanks. I kind of want to echo a couple of Kadine's ideas there, that this notion that streaming is a choice that students and families make, whereas we know that in many cases where families don't have that kind of capital to really understand the system, they've abdicated that to our better judgment. And Jillian has mentioned that a lot of how we see students is colored by biases. And another thing is that we can't accurately and objectively judge students' ability. We're not actually very good as an educational system in seeing, where students lie in terms of like how well that they might do in school. We feel that we have valid and reliable ways to determine successfully which program is most appropriate, when in fact, like Jillian just very much mentioned, that we just don't have that. Another myth is that we think that streams are fluid, right? So you can enter grade 9 applied, and if you do well, then you can move into the academic stream. And we know that looking at trajectory data, that these pathways are very much structured. It's not this a la carte kind of system that, I think people had originally thought that, you might take some of these classes in academic and some are applied. The vast majority of students take them all either as academic or as applied. And this movement that we put on paper that students can go from one to another, it just very much just doesn't happen on the whole. And we know that, when we're setting students up to go to college by taking college preparation courses, that we're not actually getting students through to college through that route. Less than half of the students that we know go through that stream aren't even accessing post-secondary education. So thinking that the system is something that you can navigate really easily is just false. Another myth is that homogeneity within a classroom is good for students and that heterogeneity is bad. As teachers, it might be less stressful to be in a relatively homogeneous classroom, but it's actually, we know that it's not good for students that are left out of the rich and challenging programming. Like Jillian mentioned, like if we look at the research related to supporting students with special education needs that are disproportionately represented in applied and essentials classes, the overall trend in that research is that they fare just as well, if not better, in inclusive settings without any detriment to students that don't have special education needs. So this, again, reiterating the points before that, we think that we're doing something good for students by putting them into these streams, and but we don't, right? And there's been so much energy being put towards just trying to make this system work, right? Like this idea that if we just stream students better, or if we're just better at it, if we get it right, then it would work. The fact is that we've spent millions and millions of dollars trying to fix streaming and trying to fix applied programming, and it just hasn't worked because the problem itself is the system, right? People also believe that de-streaming is going to be harmful, but we know that actually the status quo of streaming and a culture of low expectations is currently causing harm right now as we speak, particularly to Black children. And Black communities have been advocating for de-streaming for decades. So it's really time that we listen to folks that haven't been listened to historically. There's been this normalization of placing Black students in low-level courses, which is sustained by this structure of streaming. So that's how it needs to be dismantled and interrupted. So basically the mindset that some students can do it while some others can't is really what drives this practice of streaming, right? As educators, we really have to believe and act accordingly that a de-stream system with inclusive, differentiated, and culturally responsive teaching can make an education system one that's actually equitable and just. And we have to change the structures, but also to Nora's point, changing the structures is just one part of it. We have to change the practices that happen within the classroom as well. Otherwise, we might actually do more harm than good.
Thank you so much for that, both of you. Very humbling to hear all the things you say, because many of the things that a lot of you say, we as professionals echo in our brains to pacify or to tell us what we're doing is okay. And so I appreciate everything that you shared there. Thank you very much. For the next question, I want to, this one's for Monday and Jillian. The question is, what's the impact of streaming short-term and long-term on marginalized groups? We'll go with Monday first.
Thank you very much, Sultan, and good evening to all the viewers out there. Listen, you heard Kedin say something that I've actually never haven't thought of in a deep way, around the notion that trying to fight this streaming for a parent. This is a parent that left full-time work because her kid was going to enter school. She makes the point that it's like feeling like it's a constant fight. That is the impact on a family, that there is no time for rest. So this is what is happening in the family. Let's now go back to the student. Gillian talks to the point that streaming starts in kindergarten. I'm going to be referring to a little bit of data today, TDSB data. So Gillian and a team of others actually looked at the students in kindergarten and grade 1 that have individual education plans, the IEPs. They looked at about 10,000 students, and they found out that 81, first of all, I don't understand why anybody is putting IEPs for kids in kindergarten, but they do that. But 81% of them get these IEPs without any formal process. And in fact, you found out that for a lot of those kids, right up to grade 3, grade 4, and many of them still have these IEPs without any formal identification. So yes, Gillian, streaming starts from that far back. And what does it do to kids? And oh, by the way, of that group that have IEP, guess this, 71% of them are boys. A lot of them Black students, a lot of them Indigenous Canadian students, a lot of them students from less than wealthy families. What impact is that having in a kid that we now told from kindergarten that you are not good enough for a certain level of learning? The kids start doubting themselves. They stop believing in themselves. And that is why you're going to get a kid that we had in our stream classes in secondary school say, after recognizing that they got 80% at the end of the semester, did not even know that it was in an academic or an applied class. 80% and then says, now I know I am smart. Or the one that said, I had no thoughts of going to post-secondary. Now I know for sure I'm going to post-secondary. And the fact that I'm in a distinct class means I'm going to choose where I go. It may be college or university, but it's going to be my choice. Or the one that says, you never know you can do it unless you try it. These are kids that are selected, applied, that we just click the button and put them in the academic classes. I love these programs that you can use to, deal with some of these systemic barriers that way. Another impact that this has on students is this. So this lack of, watering down of the curriculum for the lower streams leads to what? A lot of boredom in the students. And what do bored kids do? They learn in antisocial behavior. And what do we do when kids get in issues with behavior? We put them in evening classes with further watered down curriculum. And what does that do to the kids? Makes them even more bored. And then you get that vicious cycle of low achievement, low expectation that just keeps feeding off of itself. That is why changing the streaming is difficult, because people can actually point at what they perceive to be the data that is showing that there is an applied student or a locally developed student. And the results for kids, again, talking about impact, is you get this low achievement that leads to low graduation rates for kids that say, take the applied, for example. I hope you're ready for this. 39% students that took applied in 9 and 10 graduating compared to 82% of those that took academic, right? Many of the kids that are taking applied because they are in that vicious, end up getting suspended. Heck, at graduation, 79% of the kids that took applied in 9 and 10 don't graduate. Talk about impact, right? And so what is that leading to? Is leading to the intergenerational poverty that pervades some of these historically marginalized communities, right? So, and what does that do, right? And I hope you're ready for this. It reinforces the social and economic stratification that feeds the very foundations that set the system anyway. And these are the foundations that are based on white supremacy and colonization. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jillian, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Monday. I think that's a perfect segue into this piece. I'll share a little bit about the post-secondary piece. So in terms of outcomes as a result of streaming, my colleague Rob Brown, who many of you know, always reminds me that graduation rates for a long time were the big milestone for which we could evaluate academic achievement and outcomes. But as more populations were reaching graduation, the new bar for achievement, as inequitable as that is now really access to post-secondary education. The national data on labor shows that 70% of new jobs will require some form of post-secondary education. I also know that research shows that access to post-secondary education is becoming a significant social determinant of health. It can impact how well our students do in their long run in terms of their health, but also their economic security. So what keeps me up at night around the issue of streaming is that decisions about who could or should be eligible to access post-secondary because of how the streaming structures are set up are at times determined when children are very, very young and are often based on these biased notions of ability we've been talking about. So I really do think that public education should heed to a moral imperative to ensure that students graduate. And when they do graduate, that at least be eligible to apply should they choose to pursue post-secondary education following high school. And so I think also too, I'll pick up a little bit on what Jason was speaking to around the system and kind of from our research perspective, looking largely with TDSB data, we were able to kind of track and map out the key criteria that's required to kind of have the successful pathway through to post-secondary and be eligible for post-secondary education. And so our data from TDSB shows that students who take the majority of their grade 12 courses at the university level are over 5 times as likely to access post-secondary education. And that includes college and university, not just university, but college and university. But of those students who are taking those grade 12 U courses, over 90% of them were taking courses in academic in grade 9. And we can also confirm that access to grade 9 academic courses can also be hugely limited to students who have been involved in any way with special education in elementary school. So now we're going back to decisions made when children could be as young as grades 1 and 4 in terms of what will happen to them post-high school. And on the other end of the spectrum, in a project I'm working with Carl James and Rob Brown, we've even looked at students' access to and graduation from York University. I point even though I'm home. But in this data, we see legacy relationships with ability grouping for students in their K-12 trajectories, as well as their access to York University, how they arrive to York University, meaning whether they come from like a college or another university before they arrive to York. And all of these factors hold significant relationships with whether or not students leave York with a degree. So just looking at structural streaming or formal streaming, it's very clear, as many have said tonight, that it really is a kindergarten to post-secondary issue.
Thank you so much, Monday and Jillian. You know, as I was listening to both of you, so often when people have the conversation around streaming, they think the narrative is going to live in objects like OSRs, transcripts, like that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something administrative. But what both of you have shared is we're talking about people's lives. We're talking about life expectancies. We're talking about quality of life, predictors of financial success from a child's age. So thank you so much for illustriously enveloping us in that. For our next question, before I go to that, just seeing that we're approaching 8:08, again, I wanted to mention to any of our attendees who are observing the Ramadan fast and iftar at 8 o'clock, at 8:08, know that if you press pause on your YouTube live stream, when you come back, or if you come back, it will just carry on from where you press pause. Okay, so just wanted to let everyone know there. And
can I add a point, Sultan, real quick?
Please do.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what Jillian was saying, you know, sometimes critics of de-streaming are thinking that we're just privileging university access when we're looking at this process, and that's absolutely not true, right? Like we value all the destinations, post-secondary destinations. It's just that the pathways are completely broken in how we get students there and how there's and lead to success. If we look at the college math project data from even 10 years ago, in order to really prepare students to go and be successful in college mathematics, going through college preparation math, like 11, you know, looking at 11C and 12C courses, those actually weren't preparing students to go to college and be successful there. It was taking university preparation courses that was leading students into success in college. So we have to be really, you know, we really need to think critically about not just getting students to this finish line of graduation, but thinking about longer term down the road. We have information that's telling us how to get students there and be successful. We just need to listen to it.
Thank you. And from what Jason, Monday, and Jillian had set up, now takes us into our third piece. And this won't even be a question. This will be more of a item or a discussion. So I'd like to invite Allison in here for this one to problematize streaming. You know, this is like this, we'll call this like a soapbox moment. This is a speaker's corner moment for you. Problematize streaming as an oppressive and limiting barrier to students who are, quote unquote, enlisted in it.
Thank you so much, Sultan. How did you know I needed a soapbox? I just first want to thank everybody for your contribution in this space. And especially Kadeen, there's nothing like a parent's voice to remind us how desperate the situation is. When I hear a parent use the word powerless to describe how they're feeling in public education, to feel the need to quit their job to protect their child from education, like that is very humbling. And I felt the same way when my son went to school, so I understand it. And, you know, I've spent a lot of time doing research and writing and experiencing the change from streams to de-streaming in schools. And it's led me to believe that it's an institutional act. So if you're writing notes out there, write the word institutional, that it's deliberate and oppressive, and it's one that gives the illusion of choice. And I chose this language deliberately to help us really capture, like, what is streaming? When we consider the identified forms of streaming, such as secondary pathways, special education, French immersion, specialty programs, we have to understand that these programs are built on policies. And these policies are written by people, a deliberate action that then becomes institutionalized. These policies have contributed to and uphold the disproportionate representation of particular populations from entering academic programs for decades. It's not new. This has been happening for decades. It's also been written about, and as Jason mentioned, it's been challenged for decades, yet it's still here. It still persists, and that should tell us something. I also use the language of illusion of choice, and Jason alluded to this as well, because we know, and Jillian told us this through the data, once a young person is set on a pathway in elementary school, to a large part, what happens to them in grade 9 is predetermined. We already know. So clearly that's not choice, but it is institutional and it is deliberate. I also said the word oppressive. I said it on purpose. We heard that word in the opening. And you've also heard my colleague say to you that streaming by nature means someone benefits and someone doesn't. So one of the things I think we really need to consider for us to question, to problematize, and to grapple with in this moment is who's benefiting? Why are they benefiting? And to name this group. I imagine that many of you who are listening to this webinar, you already know who doesn't benefit. Your own academic research, your perceptual knowledge, or your experiences have taught you this. And of course, we know the ministry in their endeavors to end streaming, they've named 3 groups that suffer at the hands of streaming. They've named Black, Indigenous, and racialized students. And I have to tell you, when I hear the names of these particular groups, I often shudder. And some of you out there know why I'm shuddering, because a narrative starts to develop. This very flawed thinking that pathologizes these young people that, well, this is just the way it is. This is what happens to these children. And it's not really our fault. The system's not really accountable. We negate our own complicity in it. So what I'm asking us to think about in this moment is who is benefiting and why is this happening? We know, if you've looked at the discourse and you've looked at the work, that it is not economic factors, it is not family structure, it is not the vast majority of special education designations that hold children back. It's the type of instruction in the front of them. So we need to ask ourselves as educators, what type of instruction do we need to put in place to normalize the academic success of non-dominant groups? Is the instruction riddled with high expectations? I heard that earlier from Nora, high expectations. Does it encompass self-affirming pedagogy? Is it culturally responsive? Is it critically conscious? Does it aim to help students better understand the world, their own social location? Does it teach them how to challenge it? And if it doesn't, why not? In addition to instruction, I wonder how much have we grappled with what has anchored the thinking that allows streaming to live? And Monday named it. I'm not sure how many of you wrote it in your notes. I wrote it again. But it goes back to my question, who is benefiting? One of my feeling is we have to really consider who was education created for, and Jason told us earlier. It was the elite, white, male, and economically secure. But we have to complicate this narrative with our own Canadian history. Now, when I say Canadian history, I am not talking about the fathers of Confederation. Rather, I am talking about why are all the fathers of Confederation male and white, and how did their thinking and policies serve to subjugate others? Because that's what happened. What was the thinking, the actual mindset? And someone earlier mentioned mindset. What was the thinking that allowed Sir John A. Macdonald to engage in anti-Indigenous racism in policy, to impose the head tax on Chinese immigration, and to have a strong connection to enslavement? I think it's in the work and the reading of Natasha Henry, we learn that right here in Canada, that enslavement was sanctioned and accepted for over 200 years. This has an impact. While enslavement was abolished in 1834, and there was a large sentiment in Canada that enslavement was wrong, there was another sentiment. Black people were not equal. That sentiment existed, and we can still see this sentiment in public education. We see it here in streaming. Jason mentioned segregated schools. We had segregated schools here. We're not talking about the States. We're talking about right here in Canada. And when we have a system that disadvantages some and benefits others in a repeated, continuous, and long-standing fashion, which is upheld by a historical narrative of white racial superiority, we are talking about an oppressive system, and we're talking about white supremacy. I have to say that I went back and forth in my mind. Do I say white supremacy? How might people feel? And at the end of the day, I felt that the tension and the cognitive dissonance brought up by the term white supremacy is necessary for us to actually challenge streaming. So I heard earlier, and I wrote it down, Jack said we could get into some good trouble. So that was the only license that I needed to get into some good trouble. And I want us to think about and consider what white supremacy means and how our system is built on and benefits particular populations. There's a great book that I'm currently reading. It's called Me and White Supremacy. And within that book, Layla Saad Set reminds us that white supremacy is not only upheld by a fringe group of white people. Rather, in white-centered societies and communities, it is the dominant paradigm that forms the foundation for which norms, rules, and laws are created. Some people have unearned privilege, unearned protection, and unearned power, and some people don't. And so for us, we need to really consider, what does that mean with respect to streaming? We have also learned that to challenge streaming, we have to challenge the thinking that supports it. We have to, or it won't work. To challenge streaming, we have to challenge all forms of streaming, not just applied leveled mathematics. It won't work. We also have to challenge streaming where it begins. And I think everybody has said this is a K-12 narrative. So to just close this question, I had to bring Black feminist thought into the space and quote Patricia Hill Collins. And she says, as social conditions change, so must the knowledge and practices designed to resist them. So we have to change our knowledge, what we think, and the practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. I'll just in case anyone was running to get a pen at the beginning, this is an institutional act. Streaming is an institutional act. It's deliberate and oppressive. It gives the illusion of choice. And just to implicate all of us with you, Allison, it's a system that upholds white supremacy. Full stop. So thank you for that. Moving on to the fourth question. And this one is for Monday and Jason. What potential does de-streaming offer? I think Allison gave us a very good segue into, okay, so now what? Let's do this. What potential does de-streaming offer? And what would an ideal schooling structure that supported all students equitably look like? What more needs to be thought about? Monday, would you like to take this one first?
Absolutely. So listen, the streaming is the beginning of setting the conditions right for every student to learn. That's it. It's either we want to do it or we don't. And in setting those conditions right, we will think of things like class sizes. Do we expect the streaming to work in the large classes that we become accustomed to? What we found in the work that we did at CWE Jeffries is that class sizes have to be minimized. Do we need, in fact, do we need additional supports in schools that are dealing with historic levels of underachievement? Absolutely. We know of a country, I believe it's, we know of a country that actually decided to put 2 educators in a class that would have been 1 educator, and what the results were amazing. This was, I believe, in Finland, right? So we know what works. So for me, the streaming is the beginning of setting the conditions right for everybody to be, every student to be successful. from the get-go in a de-streaming environment, students are getting the message that they can achieve at any level that they choose to. This is very important. The next thing that you get in such a structure is students are now able to choose their pathways. And Jason is right. This is not about every kid going to university. It is just about the kids choosing a pathway that is right for them. And it is a choice, not because someone told them at the age of 12 that they are good enough for a certain level, or here is the easier level. Point to me a 12-year-old that is going to make an informed choice when you give them the choice between difficult and easy. And I'll point at a liar, because, most 12-year-olds are going to choose an easier thing. So that is what the easier pathway. So that is one thing you get. The fact that kids are making informed choices about their future careers. The other thing you get in such a de-stream environment is that students feel valued. And let's get that straight, okay? And we saw a lot of that at CWE Jeffries. When kids feel valued, it played into much better mental health, much better well-being. So those are some of the things that you get. They are incidental just because you told kids they can achieve at the same level as everyone else, right? When you raise the bar, the kids are definitely going to rise to the occasion. And so it's one thing for the provincial government to say, okay, we're going to start the streaming next year. In fact, we're going to go further to say this was actually racism that was happening. I mean, when I heard that line, it really touched me. I thought the government was actually listening, finally, right? But it's one thing to do all of that stuff, right? If you don't put the resources that I talked about earlier in place, you are not going to end up with the kind of results we saw at CWE Jeffries. And here is what you get. Here is the potential that structure gives you. We saw double digits improvement in almost every success indicator. It's not just credit accumulation. It's not just EQAO scores. It's not just attendance. It's not just suspensions that you are not seeing because students are now engaged. It is, and the one that I really like to talk about though, is the fact that, so you are keeping most of your kids in school by not suspending them. More kids are coming to school because they are now, attendance is improving, right? And at the back end of it, you see a significant reduction in the dropout rate, right? So the point I want to make here is when you go into a de-streaming structure, what you're landing with is win, 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 whichever way you look at it, whichever measure you look at it, you are ending up with winning. But I want to re-emphasize the point that I started with, and that is the fact that the resources have to be in place for that to be successful, so that we don't end up with what happened in 1997. Thank you.
Jason.
So for me, to answer this question of like, well, what kind of potential does this offer? I only need to draw on my own experience of first starting out as de-streaming at my school at Westview, where Monday currently is now, about six years ago, after some professional learning that Allison actually led. And so I owe kind of everything to her in terms of opening my eyes to what streaming was. And when we decided to de-stream or go academic only in our math classes at Westview, we actually didn't have the resources because the system wasn't working with us at that point, right? There was nothing there was no additional funding. There was just this, I don't think there was even an explicit like good luck from the system. We decided to go it alone because we learned that it was the right thing to do. And we also did it during a strike year. So we had no professional learning, no team meetings, no nothing. We just kind of went with our gut and experiment. And I think Nora had a really good point that you have to be creative in a situation like when you're de-streaming. And so there was a lot of experimenting, but at the end of the day, with some flexibility, focusing on accessibility, differentiation, culturally responsiveness, like we saw that particularly for students with special education needs that were always being automatically put into applied programming, that they were excelling in ways that had never been seen before at our school. And doing so on the EQAO, which is, again, Nora pointed out, was a third-party measure. And we saw that our students with special education needs were reaching level 3 on the grade 9 math EQAO, and all at the academic level at that point, right? And higher levels than in any year before. So that really opened my eyes to see what this potential is. We were putting a ceiling on particular students. And when we took that ceiling off, they were coming up big in ways that, again, we'd never seen before. And that took a shift in the system and how we structured and how we organize students, but also in terms of how we teach. And so like Allison mentioned, teaching and the pedagogy that is in front of students is going to be so key. So even independent of smaller class sizes or all of those things that we know, when we think about this government, they're probably not going to give us, let's be honest, that we have to look at preventing some of the issues before they even begin. And again, that means we have to focus on differentiating our instruction, universal design for learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, and incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and learning as well in all of our spaces, no matter where you are, K to 12. There are also ways that, we can provide opportunities for students to go above and beyond, right? Like we know that families also want their students to feel special. And of course, like every student is special, but some parents really want them to excel and do really amazing things. And there's nothing wrong with that. And we can provide additional opportunities. There's math contests, science fairs, all like robotics competitions, arts festival, like all of these things can be done outside extracurricularly, and we can provide these chances for students. We just shouldn't let elitism or these extra motivations to differentiate yourself from others hijack our education system. We can't let them dictate how we sift and sort our students. And so we, like Monday pointed out, we have to set the conditions right for our students and teachers. Nora mentioned that this is not ideal, but that's not to say that it can't be done, because we have done de-streaming and challenged these practices and structures in just as bad of conditions, and they've led to some amazing things happening for our students. So like I want to echo Nora again, we cannot let the pandemic and all of these external factors we can't allow that to be an excuse for us not to continue and do this work, because like she said, it's more important now than it ever was before.
Thank you so much. So basically it's good teaching, reduce class size, high expectations, if to go the extra mile, rich extracurriculars, and the belief that it will actually work. If I could throw in my own 2 cents, a removal of all excuses that it won't work, perhaps. So thank you so much for that, Monday and Jason. That was very, very clear and articulate, and not outside of our reach, in my belief. So thank you very much for that. And taking us to our 5th question. This question is going to be posed to Kadeen, Allison, and Jillian, and we'll have it answered in that order as well. So question 5, de-streaming in practice. What does it look like? What should people be aware of? How can we avoid creating more barriers to access in the process? Okay, so we'll start off with Kadeen.
Thank you. It's an appropriate question to kind of bring us to, close to the end of our conversation. From a community's perspective or from a parent's perspective, I feel like there, and definitely from my own personal experience, is that, when there's these kind of deep-seated distrust of institutions and systems in place, my biggest concern is that, the success that has been won in the past year to end streaming, at least in grade 9 and for grade 9 math, right? And that will lead and include all of, eventually all of high school courses, is that, systems get more subversive in how they, implement or administer oppressions, if you will. So while we may have won in the high school forum or in that arena, what is that going to mean for our kindergarten experiences now, right? Like, are there going to be ways that they're going to buckle down the, these kind of this branding, that is placed on students so young. So that's a huge concern for me. And how are we going to address those kind of, shifting, the shift in the systems as well. But I'm going to say for parents specifically, let's not defer all the responsibility of this work to policy, to governments, to ministry, to the, to the institutions and the administrators, right? Because expectations that they'll make everything right in some ways feels like the same expectation that they're the experts and they know what's best for our children. And so I'm going to say, like, equal emphasis should be put on building awareness, ensuring that resources and access to information, as well as access and opportunities to engage with coalitions and organizers around this is really important, because as parents, we are engaging other parents. We're sitting on our school councils, right? We are advocating in various ways. We are connecting with services and other things. So there's a lot that we can do inside of schools, at councils, in our interactions and relationships with administrators to really support other parents and families and children, through these systems. How are we working with each other when it's time for, SST meetings and things like that? How do we support each other to be able to really advocate for our children? And this is where I'm saying to parents that if there is a feeling of hopelessness at any point or powerlessness, seek out support, seek out parents, you understand, seek out other groups that are there that can support you and help you. And that's what I say. I say that we have so much power, and we should and know that we have the ability to use it when we need to. Thank you.
Thank you. I think just to add first to what Kadeen was saying, the one thing I think parents can do, regardless of whether you have a deep knowledge of the education system or no knowledge, is to set your expectation. And I say this to every parent group I've ever spoken to. Tell the teacher you expect your child to achieve, and what will they do to make that happen. That is their job. So even if you don't know anything about the curriculum or what they're supposed to be using or the fancy curriculum language, tell them what you want for your child. So just that last message for parents as a reminder. I think from an administrator perspective, I have so many concerns about streaming and how we're engaging with it. I do want to say everybody has a great deal of power to do something about it. There's nothing hopeless about the situation. And we all have to recognize what our sphere of power is and to use it. So for those who are out there in the education field, I think the first question I'd ask us to think about is what do you believe? Did you believe that streaming was a problem before the board said it was and before the government said it was? And if your answer is no, I wonder if you really believe it's a problem now. If they said, forget this streaming thing tomorrow, would you forget it? And I think that's a starting place for some. What do we actually believe about streaming? Do you actually believe there is oppression within the schools? And if you do believe there's oppression, do you know how to notice it? Do you know how to name it? And do you know how to act? And if you don't, it's incumbent upon us to figure it out. It's part of what we do under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's part of our human rights policy. I think as educators, we must challenge the thinking that's happening in the schools. Why did we believe this was okay? The other thing, as we begin to de-stream applied, is where are those students going? I have this suspicion and this really gross feeling that a lot of those students are going to locally developed and not academic, because the province made a decision to get rid of applied. Now we know from a lot of research, removing the lowest stream first is what the research suggests. So we need to ask ourselves, did we create more streams when this came in? Did we automatically have this new extra stream in grade 9 that didn't exist before to restream? So if we don't believe streaming was wrong, chances are we're finding other ways to stream the children. So we need to be very cognizant as practitioners of what we actually believe and how we're choosing to challenge, and what we will change in terms of our practice is another big concern in my mind. We've mentioned a few times the pedagogy. If we're not using culturally responsive pedagogy, critical consciousness, self-affirming, understanding our own social location, then we're still teaching from a dominant pedagogy. A dominant pedagogy continues to uphold white supremacy. So we need to think, doing culturally responsive pedagogy isn't the equity thing to do. It's the right thing to do to teach the children in the classroom. And if you're not doing that, then you're upholding white supremacy. So those are some of the things that float in my mind when I think about what we still need to really, really think about, because this is a very small piece of the puzzle where we're at right now.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Katie. So yes, de-streaming is important, but why? And I leave with 3 points from research to consider. One is that ability grouping is an ineffective pedagogical strategy. Aside from the fact that ability groups are often formed based on discriminatory notions of ability, the research on ability grouping has shown that the practice is not only ineffective system strategy, but it is also harmful, particularly for students allocated to lower ability groups. Point 2, as we've seen from the research on streaming, ability grouping is often permanent. And I love Kadine's point about how systems are subversive in ensuring that these streams are maintained. I think that's something we really have to hold close. Our data shows that there is a linearity to pathways that once set, it's really, really tough to deviate. So back to Kadine's point, like how the ability grouping happens, through which system it happens, and under what guise it happens, this established ability hierarchy that is a prominent component of public schooling will follow and organize students throughout their education trajectory, resulting in disparate post-high school opportunities. And then the last point I'll mention is when we stream, as Monday was mentioning too, students know it and they feel it, and so do their families. And to this point, I'll just bring up, there's a relatively recent study from the UK that talks about And as Alison said, get out your pen because it's a great title. It's called The Symbolic Violence of Setting, and setting being streaming, and speaks directly to how ability grouping works to disenfranchise particular groups of students and how that oppression becomes embodied. So authors Archer et al. Claim that streaming is counter-evidential, meaning it is not supported by research or empirical evidence, yet remains an incredibly popular practice worldwide. And that's because, as they argue, streaming is providing another kind of service. And I quote from them saying that streaming, or setting as it's called in the UK, can be, this is the quote, can be interpreted as a technology of social reproduction, which reflects the interests of the privileged and is designed to maintain social class and racialized inequalities and unequal relation. So the evidence is clear that streaming needs to be addressed, but I also want to put a plug in that while we work to remove these formal streaming structures, and as has been mentioned by everyone on the panel tonight about the importance of pedagogy and what we do in the classrooms, is that we also keep those informal contexts and informal forms of streaming in mind as well. So even when formal structures are removed, the work will continue, and it is work, but it's worth it. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Katie and Jillian and Allison. That was excellent. As everyone can see, we have gone past the 8:30 endpoint, but the conversation is so lively, and we're on YouTube Live, so press pause to come back to it. But we just wanted to keep up with the momentum and also have an opportunity to have a question from the YouTube Live chat to come through to our panelists to share their perspectives as well. And I'm just waiting for the question to be typed up right now, and it's not. So I'm going to, oh, hey, Saima, welcome to the chat. I'm going to give you the mic and you can ask a question from the chat box.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to our audience members, to our panel members, first of all, for all of this amazing, you've got a lot of questions coming in because we have a very engaged audience, and thank you so much to our audience members who are sticking it out right to the end here because they're so engaged. What I wanted to point out is there was a question in the chat box that was asking questions about the nature of the schools that were piloted for the streaming. Either Monday or Jason, did you want to quickly speak to what that looked like at Westview, and then maybe Nora is.
I could step in here. So C.W. Jeffries is a semester school, and it is a school that is populated by a lot of the historically marginalized groups. And to Alison's points, if there are any people out there that still doubt that the streaming works, this is a school that was populated by overwhelming majority of the historically marginalized groups. And we show that the streaming can work there, given the current structures, right? So in a nutshell, to answer that question, that is a school we are, and we were able to do well there.
Right.
Yeah, at Westview, where I was at when we went to academic only in our English and our math classes to begin, that was also a semester program. And I know that there's discussions around, well, maybe you can reorganize your program so that you can stretch learning out for longer. And of course, there's definitely ways that you can do that. That was just not something that was afforded to us. Again, because our system, behind us that was supporting wasn't really there. So we just kind of went with what we had, knowing that we needed to disrupt streaming practices, and we just did, and we just worked with what we had. And so I think I don't think that semestered or non-semestered is really a big issue. There's pros and cons to each of these, and advantages and disadvantages to them as well.
And if I can just add something quickly, at Westview, where I am now, Westview is number 2 on the Learning Opportunities Index. It is a measure of the incomes in the community. And so being number 2 actually means only one other community in the in the TDSB has parents that make less than Westview. So it's this thing can be done anywhere. It's whether we want to do it or not, whether we want to continue to reinforce the foundations of white supremacy or not. It's that simple.
Great. Thank you so much, Monday. Nora?
So in the school where we started in Limestone, it was a rural northern school. It was a small school and a high Indigenous population, and also a lot of families who were economically disadvantaged in the area. Sort of, and rural poverty is different than urban poverty, I would say, but certainly we saw some of that there. We really wanted to support the success of it because it wasn't a grassroots movement. It was centrally supported. And so we supported the school in terms of moving to full year with the idea that it would provide some more learning time. What I would say about that is there were disadvantages and advantages to that model. And I think that, other members have said it very clearly. I think we can look for all the reasons why this won't work. And class size often comes up as well. And, there's lots of research out there about class size and it actually not impacting student outcomes. So I think we have to be honest about what the research tells us, but also recognize that this shift in practice is going to be a tough one. So what we can do to try to work alongside and support that feeling of teacher confidence in making this change, I think that will assist long-term. And that's a challenge for us, I think, in the province of Ontario right now because of the way that the change is coming in. But I think that's our call to action even greater than, despite all of that, we can make this successful, would be my position with it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I think, we had many questions that spoke exactly to kind of some of the tensions that you're speaking to right over here, there was overlaps in what would you say to educators who feel that the applied classes benefit students because it allows for closer proximity, smaller class sizes. What would you say to people who are working within boards who are wanting to do this work, but are feeling that they're not being supported? What are some practical things that they can do to kind of move in that way, given that they are wanting to, but they're feeling that the class sizes really are impacting their ability to do so?
I mean, I think one thing that we can just put into the space is it simply isn't true that smaller classes will facilitate what's needed. We know that by nature of applied, it's smaller. Why? So that we can give a better education. And it didn't work. Like, we know it doesn't work. And we can understand when we started this work in TDSB about 8 years ago, we didn't have the system supports at that time, because we were sort of a rogue group. And it was just lovely that Jason and Monday came along. They're like, okay, we're in it. So despite the lack of supports, the success was there. But I think what Nora said is also very salient. It was not easy. It was really difficult because, let's be real, it's starting in grade 9. Kids are going to come with significant gaps. They will come. And that's one of the problems with starting at grade 9, right? We need to look at the streams that are taking place in elementary school so that the gaps are a little smaller. However, even given the fact that there are significant gaps, if we're using appropriate instructional strategies, we're scaffolding, we have multiple entry points, there are ways to do it. And sometimes it's finding those other schools that have tried it to get the support around it. And I also think in a school, having an environment and a culture of learning is so key. And when you're together with your other teachers saying, okay, we're gonna do this thing, even if I don't know how to do it, and you're working together because you're saying, if I try this, will the students be more successful? If I use UDL and DI from a culturally responsive space, will students be more successful? If they're doing it together as a collective, then it can work. So my suggestion to teachers who are saying, oh my goodness, I don't know, is to take some time to look at what strategies have worked and phone a friend and do it together. To the administrators that are really stressed because it seems like the classes are bigger, let's look at what the research and data has really said. It's how we teach and not so much what we teach, but how we teach it that makes the difference for the young people. And we don't get to say, it might be a little too hard, because I want to go back to where we started, which is this is urgent. It's an urgent issue that results in shorter lifespans. So don't tell me that it's hard. We have to do it. That's what we signed up for in public education. But find a friend, because we do it together. When Jason did it, it wasn't a walk in the park. When Monday did it, it wasn't a walk in the park. I remember him telling me about his staff meeting and how bananas it was, but we worked through those pieces. So we do these things together, and we do it from a space of humility and collaboration.
Right. Thank you so much.
All right, everybody. That takes us to the conclusion of the night, and what a night. To give you an idea of the analytical side, we've already had 1,001 people replay back this stream. At the highest point, we had 500 people watching us, and now we still have 375 people sticking it out with us right now. So I wanted to show much respect and appreciation to all of those who joined us on the live stream, and to those who are watching us in the future on future recordings. Thank you for coming through. So, what a night, and lots of takeaways. This is a conversation starter as we move into a phase in our educational realm that is just actually scratching at the surface of the complex nature of the many systems that has created conditions for discrimination and oppression that truly impact students' lives, both in the near and distant future. We hope that you've been able to take away a more fulsome understanding of these complexities, as well as some actionables to bring into your practice, or at the very least, enough to engage in a critical discourse with your colleagues and members of society and the education field. For all we want at the end of the day is for our students to truly live up to their full potential, and for you to believe in them to live up to that full potential. And while this brings us to an end to our 2020 FESI session to a close, please continue to follow us on FESI Twitter feed and read about us and find out about what FESI 2021 will hold and will unfold on our FESI blog. Again, that's fesi.blog.yorku.ca. And I want to take this moment right now to give a strong appreciation and thank you to our panelists, Monday Gala, Allison Games San Vicente, Jillian Perrick, Jason Toe, Kadeen Bankasing. The strength in what you shared today, the strength in not only the evidence but in your conviction, is enough for us to get out of our feelings and to take a risk on our students, because you did, and it shows to be successful. And we thank you for sharing your experiences and your insights with us. Thank you very much. And for everyone else in the interweb live stream or in the future, we wish you a very happy life. Be well, and please be safe. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.